So silicon technology has really taken off the last decades, and while it could maybe also be, this technology could be used to make better organs on chip. So this picture just shows you that from the 50s to today, we have a massive increase of functionality and decrease of size by silicon technology. The problem or the challenge that is today still there in these organ-on-chip systems, which are just very young, of course, but is that you have a very nice microfluidic structure and you have a lot of possibilities already, but how to automate making those, because this is now done basically gluing in the lab. There are no sensors in such a device, so we've seen a few examples of looking at the cells. So you need some imagers there, a big microscope maybe. Actuators are not in there. The cost of such a device, by making it, if you need some millions, for example, for a pharmaceutical industry, could be very high cost if somebody has to glue it together. And so scaling as well, so how do we scale such devices? So I'm going to talk about a few silicon technologies for organs on a chip. First one, electrical sensors and actuators, and this is, of course, more interesting for electrogenic cells, such as heart cells and brain cells, and then imaging systems. And we also do biosensors and fluidics, but that would lead me too far for today. So first, state-of-the-art in electrical recording. How do we record cellular signals? I mentioned already one of the first slides, the conventional patch clamp, which is basically a very manual method, which you have in the lab, where you go with your glass pipette close to a cell and actually record from a single cell. It's a very beautiful method developed in the 70s, still used by many labs if you really want to look what is going on in a cell. But for pharmaceutical industry, very difficult because it's such labor-intensive and so low throughput. Then there are the micro or multi-electrode arrays, which are chips, basically, that have the electrodes planar, so organized on the surface, and then the cells are grown on top. And then there's a sort of new patch clamp technique, which is called planar patch clamp. Now the pipettes are being replaced by holes inside a chip surface, and then the cell is kind of growing or sucked onto it, and then the same method as the patch clamp is being used. But there are a few drawbacks as well. So the good thing about conventional patch clamp is you're working on a very single cell, obviously. You have a very nice signal coming out, so a very high signal-to-noise ratio, because you make a very good seal between the pipette and the cell, and you can measure single ion channels. Of course, this is an invasive technique because you go on top of the cell, and actually a part of the membrane is inside your pipette. So when you pull out the pipette, you break the cell, and also because you make such a large hole in the cell, you get washout of molecules, and your cell will die in about 1 hour. It's very low throughput, as I said, and you need very trained users to do this. Then, actually, with the coming of the microelectrode arrays, this was, well, revelation, because you have now non-invasive method of looking at electrical activity of cells, because the cells are just growing on top of these electrodes. It's already medium throughput, and it's quite easy to perform. Drawback is that they have very large electrodes, much larger than the cell typically, and you pick up signals from multiple cells at the same time. You have also a low signal-to-noise ratio, and you have limited information in the signal. I will show you in a minute. Then the planar patch clamp just takes over basically the advantages of the conventional patch clamp, which is you single cell, and now we have very high throughput method. But here we work with dissociated cells. It means that if you want to test a cell, you have to bring basically single cells onto this hole which is in the chip. So the cells are not nicely growing in a monolayer or at least in a sort of organ-like structure. So they're just dissociated. It's still invasive technique. You can still measure only for 1 hour, and this one is expensive. However, that might not be a problem for the pharmaceutical industry. So what is our approach using silicon? We used the principle of the multi-electrode array chip. to record action potential. So we have a CMOS chip. Instead of a few electrodes here that are very large, we put more than 16,000 electrodes on this chip. They're very small, the electrodes. And so you can record from many cells at the same time. So what is the concept behind that? So this is a cardiomyocyte here on the left, growing on top of these very small electrodes. You see that they're much smaller than the cell itself. So if you record from those, you record from the single cell. That's already a big advantage compared to the traditional MEA systems. But also the signal that we can get, it's looking much better. So an extracellular signal in regular MEA would look like the red trace. It's just basically a spike. And you know that a cardiomyocyte doesn't, intracellularly, it doesn't look like a spike. As I just showed you in the first slides, it's a very complicated, very nice signal. So we can actually get sort of this signal, almost the same, which we call quasi-intracellular signal. You see a nice upstroke, you see the plateau, and then the repolarization of the cardiac action potential, because we actually make a very small pores inside the cell membrane, and we record while having the cell open. It's kind of in between patch clamp and MEA, if you want. So this assay might be very interesting for drug screening, because we can look for a longer time. We can even repeat this electroporation because it's non-invasive, so the cell will just be fine afterwards, and you can just open up the cell again and look again intracellularly. And we can do this for multiple days, which is interesting because we can then look at dynamic effects of a drug, not just 1 hour recording, but then dynamically over multiple days, which of course gives us much more information.